The studio lights burned brightly on the set of the late-night talk show Spotlight, where Fiona Carrington reigned as queen of cutting wit and unapologetic progressive fire. Known for grilling politicians, celebrities, and cultural icons alike, Fiona had built her brand on confrontation and charisma. Her viewers adored her, tuning in every night for a show that was as sharp as it was unfiltered. During a routine production meeting, one of the producers threw out a daring idea. What if we invited BTS? The room buzzed, half excited, half skeptical. BTS, the global K-pop superstars? Some saw it as a gold mine for views, others feared it might be too risky. But Fiona's eyes lit up. This wasn't just about ratings. This was her chance to challenge what she called the performance of perfection. In her mind, they were image-obsessed idols with loyal fans but little substance, especially Jimin. He fascinated her the most, known for his softness, his tears on stage, his poetic words. "This could be legendary," she murmured, already imagining the sound of laughter when she hit them with her most piercing questions. She dove into interviews, concerts, behind-the-scenes clips. She scribbled sarcasm-laced notes in the margins of her cue cards. Meanwhile, halfway across the globe in Seoul, Jimin sat with the other BTS members in their studio lounge when the invitation came through. He held the sleek black envelope gently, eyes scanning the crisp words. "You sure you want to do this, Hyung?" Jungkook asked. "This isn't exactly army territory." Jimin smiled faintly, his voice soft but steady. "A conversation's still a conversation. People can laugh, mock, judge, but that doesn't change the truth." RM raised an eyebrow. "She's known for tearing people down." "I know," Jimin replied. "That's her job. Mine is just to speak from the heart." The days leading up to the interview were intense. Not for BTS, but for Fiona's team, who curated every question with irony and bite. They wanted to provoke, to poke holes in the band's image, to catch them off guard. But Jimin continued his usual routine. He rehearsed choreography, practiced vocals, and even sent handwritten notes to the staff who'd be working backstage. He didn't prepare a defense. He didn't believe in armor. When the day arrived, the studio buzzed with energy. The audience was a mix: Fiona's loyal fans, a few curious armies, and skeptics drawn in by the buzz online. Fiona, backstage, reviewed her monologue one last time. Sharp, ruthless, perfect. "This is going to be a ratings hit," said her head writer. "Just remember," Fiona smirked, adjusting her mic, "don't give him too much space to respond. He shouldn't have time to keep up with me." Meanwhile, BTS arrived at the studio without fanfare. Jimin, dressed in a sleek cream jacket and black slacks, walked with quiet confidence. Behind him, Taehyung and Namjoon exchanged uncertain glances. Jungkook muttered, "Last chance to change your mind." Jimin just smiled. "You guys worry too much. It's just a conversation." He took a sip of water as he watched Fiona's name flash on the studio monitor and heard the cheers thunder through the building. Jungkook whispered, "They're on her side already." "She's doing her way," Jimin said, calm and grounded. "Ours is just to be real." Fiona opened the show with a polished monologue. It started with harmless jabs, but quickly shifted. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced with theatrical flair, "tonight we are joined by global icons. BTS, the boy band that proved tears and eyeliner could sell out stadiums. Especially Jimin, the man who cried on stage and made vulnerability trendy." The audience erupted in laughter and applause. Backstage, Jimin watched the screen silently. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. "She's relentless," Taehyung murmured. Jimin nodded once. "She's doing what they expect her to do." Finally, Fiona called them out. Applause mixed with scattered boos as BTS stepped onto the stage. Fiona extended her hand as Jimin approached first. He shook it gently, smiled at the audience with quiet grace, and took his seat. "Jimin," Fiona began in a light but biting tone, "welcome to the program." "Thank you for having us," he said, voice calm and clear. "You've got a beautiful audience." Fiona leaned in. "Oh, they love a good debate. Are you ready?" Jimin smiled softly. "Always." The match had begun, but what happened next would defy every expectation. And so, the verbal duel everyone had been waiting for officially began. The studio was overflowing with tension and excitement. Fiona was poised to dominate, armed with sharp questions and cutting humor. Jimin, meanwhile, sat with serene poise. He had nothing to prove, and that quiet confidence was already beginning to unsettle Fiona. Their energies couldn't have been more different. Fiona sparkled with performance energy, bold, clever, assertive. Jimin radiated calm, sincerity, and self-possession. The contrast was striking. Then Fiona launched the first jab. "So, Jimin," she said with a smirk that didn't quite reach her eyes, "you've been in the spotlight for years now, adored by millions. Ever think it's time to let the next generation take over?" The audience chuckled, sensing the mockery behind the question. Jimin tilted his head slightly, as if giving the idea real consideration. "Well, Fiona," he said in a gentle, clear voice, "I've always believed that what matters isn't age or timing. It's what you bring to the table. If you still have something meaningful to give, why stop?" His response drew soft, respectful applause. But Fiona wasn't done. "Sure, but times do change, don't you think?" she pressed. "A lot of your choices have been revolutionary, but not exactly conventional. Don't you think some of your methods are a little outdated for today's world?" More laughter and applause erupted. Fiona had landed another punch, but Jimin remained composed. He leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "I think it's important to remember," he replied with calm conviction, "that every decision we make reflects the time and the challenges we're living in. Sure, ideas evolve, but that doesn't mean we should erase what came before. Real progress is about learning from the past, not deleting it." The energy in the room began to shift. The laughter faded, replaced by a contemplative silence. Fiona tried to pull the momentum back in her favor. "Fair point," she shrugged, then leaned forward again. "But let's get real. You've always been very direct about what you believe in. And let's just say not everyone here agrees with you. Aren't you worried that being so open might alienate people who once admired you?" Jimin smiled, locking eyes with her. "I've always believed in being honest about who I am," he said. "If that makes some people uncomfortable, that's okay. Integrity isn't about pleasing everyone, it's about standing for something even when it's not easy." A low murmur rippled through the audience, part surprise, part agreement. Fiona pushed closer. "But don't you think that kind of stubbornness makes you seem out of touch?" she asked, feigning concern. "The world's changing fast, and some would say you're clinging too hard to the past." Jimin let out a soft, amused laugh. "You call it clinging," he replied gently. "I call it staying grounded. Yes, the world moves fast, but sometimes, in our rush to change everything, we forget the value of what came before." For a moment, the studio fell completely silent. Even Fiona seemed briefly thrown off by the quiet clarity of his words. "It's okay," she said at last, trying to smile. "Surely you'd agree that there's always room for improvement?" "Of course," Jimin replied without hesitation. "There's always room to grow. But growth doesn't mean tearing everything down. It means building on what's already there. You can't write a new chapter if you keep ripping out the old pages." The audience, once laughing and clapping at Fiona's barbs, now sat quietly, thinking. Even Fiona, usually quick with a comeback, didn't speak for a few seconds. The conversation went on. Fiona fired more pointed questions. Jimin answered each one calmly, precisely, never defensive, never rattled. She played with provocation. He played with conviction. And slowly, steadily, the balance on stage began to tilt. The audience, who had clearly started the night in Fiona's corner, began to see Jimin differently. His sincerity was magnetic. His vulnerability didn't make him weak. It made him real. By the end of the segment, Fiona's jokes began to feel forced. Jimin's quiet strength, on the other hand, resonated with unexpected power. This was no ordinary interview. Fiona, sensing her grip slipping, went for a heavier blow. "Well, let's talk about your bold decisions," she said with a playful edge that cut deep. "Militarizing your shows with themes of trauma, mental health, even national pride. Pretty intense. Don't you think that sends the wrong message, especially to younger fans?" The audience burst into laughter and applause. It was a well-prepared jab. Jimin, unshaken, simply waited until the room quieted. Well, Fiona, he said in a low, deliberate tone, it's easy to judge things when you don't know the context. Those choices, the heavy themes, they weren't made for drama. They came from real places. Struggles with identity, mental health, grief. If that seems extreme, maybe it's because we define bravery differently. The studio went still. Fiona blinked, surprised by the unwavering calm in his voice. Recovering, she said, "That's an interesting perspective. But surely you admit some of it was too aggressive? Too much. Don't you worry about that." Jimin leaned forward slightly, folding his hands. "Adversity has always been part of life," he said. "Our art doesn't glorify pain. It faces it. Life isn't always soft, and sometimes we have to walk through hard places to protect what matters." The weight of his words hung in the air. People in the crowd began nodding. Fiona changed the subject, trying to steer the conversation forward. "Okay," she said with a forced smile. "Let's leave the past behind and talk about the present. You've been very vocal about your beliefs, and some of them are, let's say, controversial. Don't you think that's affected your image? Maybe lost you some fans who once admired you?" Jimin leaned back, thoughtful but unbothered. "Maybe," he admitted softly. "But I've never been interested in being popular, Fiona. I'm interested in being honest. If you try to make everyone happy, you lose yourself. My goal was never to be perfect, just true. That's all anyone can really do." For the first time, Fiona paused, not because she wanted to, but because she didn't know what to say. Her usual strategy wasn't working, and the room was beginning to feel it too. Jimin wasn't defending himself. He wasn't reacting or trying to win. He was simply being real. His calm sincerity had begun to win over the audience, not with argument, but with truth. Fiona, sensing the shift, leaned in again. Her tone softened, just slightly. "He seems pretty comfortable with who he is," she said with a hint of curiosity. "But don't you believe there's value in evolving, in leaving behind old ideas and embracing new ones?" Jimin looked directly at her, steady, unwavering. "Of course I do," he said. "But evolving doesn't mean abandoning your roots. It means understanding them, learning from them, and carrying forward what's truly meaningful." He paused. The studio was silent. "The problem today," he continued, "is that too many people want to tear everything down without thinking about what they're building in its place." A deep silence followed, not awkward, profound. Even Fiona, who was used to owning every room she walked into, had no words. Jimin turned to the audience, his expression softening. "I know," he said. "To some people I'm young. To others, maybe I seem too old-fashioned. But life isn't about always being right. It's about being true to yourself, even when it's hard. And it's about listening, especially when you disagree." In the front row, a young woman wiped away a tear. The same audience that had once burst into laughter at Fiona's jokes now sat in contemplative silence. Even Fiona looked visibly moved, the edge in her voice replaced by something gentler. "Would you mind," Jimin asked quietly, "if I shared a little story?" Fiona hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead," she said softly. The studio shifted. What began as a duel was about to become something deeper. The lights didn't change, but everything else did. Jimin leaned forward, his voice calm and thoughtful. "You know," he began, "people see BTS now and think it's always been this way. But it wasn't easy, especially for someone like me." He looked down for a moment, then continued. "I didn't come from a famous family. I didn't have connections. I was just a kid from Busan who loved to dance, who had dreams that felt too big for someone like me." The audience let out a soft murmur. Not laughter this time, but surprise at his humility. "When I started, I wasn't anyone," he said. "I had tiny gigs, no spotlight, just a lot of closed doors. People told me I wasn't strong enough, that I didn't have the voice or the look, that I should give up, that boys like me don't make it." He let those words sit in the air. "I could have believed them," he said. "I could have walked away. Most people probably would have. But something inside me said, just keep going." So I did. Jimin's gaze slowly scanned the audience. "I trained harder. I learned from every failure, every rejection. I listened. I kept showing up. And when the opportunities didn't come, I didn't wait for them. I created my own way forward. Fiona, ready to interrupt, found herself leaning in instead, caught off guard by the raw honesty in his voice. And then one day he continued, I got my chance. It wasn't huge, it wasn't global, but to me, it meant everything. I got to stand on a stage and show the world a piece of who I was. He paused, as if seeing that stage in his mind. The funny thing about opportunity, he said with a faint smile, is that it doesn't come with guarantees. It gives you a door, but you have to decide what to do once you walk through it. The audience was now completely silent, not out of discomfort, but reverence. I didn't work harder for fame, Jimin said, or money. I did it out of respect. Respect for the chance. Respect for every kid like me who thought they weren't enough. Fiona sat frozen. Her usual arsenal of smirks and follow-up jabs had vanished. Jimin looked out at the studio. Success doesn't make life easier, he added, his voice firmer now. If anything, the challenges get bigger. People try to shape you, tell you how to act, and you have to decide, will you become who they expect or stay who you are? He looked back at the crowd. And what I've learned, he said slowly, is that integrity isn't measured in the big moments. It's in the small ones, the ones where no one is watching, but you still choose to do the right thing. When you take the harder path, because it's right. A young man in the back nodded slowly. A woman in the front wiped another tear. Jimin's story wasn't just his, it was everyone's in some way. Fiona cleared her throat. Her voice was softer now, hesitant. That's quite a journey, she said. But surely there were times you wanted to give up? Jimin nodded, his face relaxed. Of course, he said. We all feel that. But doubt doesn't mean you should stop. It's just part of the path. If you stay true to yourself, the path becomes clear, even when it's hard. The silence that followed was thick, sacred, as if his words had wrapped around the entire room like a warm blanket. Fiona leaned back in her chair, for the first time, speechless. Jimin had done something extraordinary. He had transformed a stage set for confrontation into a space of reflection and connection. When the cameras cut for a commercial break, the audience erupted in applause. But it wasn't the applause of amusement or routine approval. It was the kind of applause that says, thank you for telling the truth. Humble as always, Jimin simply bowed his head and offered Fiona a small, respectful smile. The truth was becoming clear to everyone in the room. This wasn't the confrontation she had planned. This wasn't a takedown. Jimin wasn't just a K-pop idol with perfect choreography and a soft voice. He was a man who had walked through fire and come out not hard, but wise. You're right, Jimin said gently. There have been many moments where giving up felt easier. His voice remained steady, but his eyes carried the weight of everything behind it. I'm not immune to doubt or fear. None of us are. But resilience isn't about never feeling those things. It's about how you respond to them. The audience listened with full attention. Gone were the snickers, the ironic smiles. What began as disbelief had become genuine curiosity. Each of Jimin's words sliced through the usual noise of a late-night show, and suddenly everything superficial disappeared. You know, he continued, people misunderstand resilience. They think it means being strong all the time, never breaking. But that's not it. He paused. Resilience means learning to bend without breaking. It means knowing that even if life knocks you down, again and again, you still get up every single time. Fiona tilted her head slightly, unable to hide her interest anymore. And where, she asked, now with real curiosity, do you think that strength comes from? Jimin smiled softly. From the small things, he said. From the people who believe in you when you're doubting yourself. From the lessons hidden inside your failures. From the mistakes that teach you who you really are. But above all, from having a why, a purpose. Without that, it's hard to keep going. Silence returned to the studio, not cold, but reverent. His words fell like a soft rain, gentle and persistent. Even Fiona, usually armed with comebacks, sat quietly, letting his words settle. But not everyone knows their purpose, she said after a moment. What about the people who feel lost? who don't know what they're supposed to be doing. How do they find that why? Jimin leaned forward slightly, folding his hands together. You don't find it overnight, he said. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it changes, but the most important thing is to not stop looking. Keep showing up, even when it feels pointless. Pay attention, even when you're tired. He looked around the audience, because a lot of the answers we're looking for are hiding in the things we overlook, in the people we meet, in the moments we almost ignore, in the challenges we think we can't overcome. He paused again. Purpose isn't something handed to you, he said. It's something you build, piece by piece. A young man in the audience nodded. A woman near the back wiped her cheek quietly. Even Fiona looked out at the crowd, surprised by the emotional shift in the room. He wasn't just speaking to her anymore. He was speaking to everyone. That's a powerful perspective, Fiona admitted, her tone no longer laced with irony. But let's bring it back to you. You've faced criticism, challenges, even failure. How do you keep going when it feels like the world's against you? Jimin let out a low, warm laugh. You keep going, he said, because what else is there? Giving up isn't in my nature. He looked at her calmly. The world isn't always fair, Fiona, and it's not always kind, but that doesn't mean you stop fighting for what matters. He paused, just enough to let it land. You don't have to win every battle. Sometimes, just being present is enough. That line struck something deep, the simplicity of it. Fiona, who had once dismissed him as an idealistic artist clinging to outdated ideas, now saw something else entirely. She saw a man who had walked through doubt, rejection, loneliness, and emerged with clarity. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't clever for the sake of it. He was real. The audience felt it too. The laughter from earlier had long faded. What filled the room now was something deeper. Introspection, stillness. And I'll tell you something else, Jimin said, his tone now firmer. Resilience isn't just for the big moments. It's also in the small ones. The times you choose to stay quiet instead of shouting. The times you listen instead of arguing. The times you do the right thing, even when no one is watching. The crowd broke into applause. Not the loud, performative kind that followed Fiona's punchlines, but the honest, heartfelt kind that comes from knowing you've heard something true. Jimin nodded in thanks. Humble, centered. Fiona glanced at her notes and closed the folder. They no longer mattered. I have to admit, she said, her voice full of admiration, I didn't expect this conversation to take this direction, but I'm glad it did. Jimin smiled softly. Life is full of surprises, Fiona, he replied. Sometimes, you just have to let them happen. The cameras panned across the audience, capturing thoughtful expressions. Faces were quiet, hands resting in laps, eyes focused. At that moment, it was clear. Jimin's message hadn't just reached Fiona. It had reached everyone. Resilience, as he so gently but powerfully explained, wasn't about being unbreakable. It was about learning to bend without breaking and rising again and again. As the conversation continued, Fiona sat more relaxed in her chair. Her earlier defiance had melted into curiosity. Jimin, calm and grounded, now carried the entire room with his words alone. Jimin, she said, now speaking like a human being, not a host. We've talked about resilience and purpose. But let me ask something a little deeper. She leaned in. You've made tough decisions in your career. You've walked away from opportunities, faced harsh criticism, gone against what was expected of you. What motivated you? Was it stubbornness or something else? Jimin smiled and tilted his head slightly. Some people do call it stubbornness, he said with a little glint in his eye. But I call it integrity. He paused, not for effect, but for clarity. It's about knowing who you are, what you stand for, and refusing to compromise that, even when it's tempting. The word integrity hung in the air like incense. Fiona leaned back, thoughtful. But that comes at a peak, she said softly. Being true to yourself is admirable, yes, but what about the opportunities you miss? The people who walk away? Don't you ever feel alone? Jimin took a breath before answering. There's always a cost, he said, but losing yourself costs far more. He looked into the audience. I've seen people in this industry, in life, give away pieces of themselves just to fit in, to be liked, to succeed. And sure, maybe they get what they want at first, but eventually they feel empty. He paused. Because when you lose your integrity, you lose the part of you that actually matters. The room was silent. Fiona nodded slowly. She didn't try to argue. She understood. Can you give an example? She asked gently. Jimin folded his hands, thinking. There was a moment early in my career, he said. I was offered a project, one that would have given me massive exposure, recognition, headlines. But the message behind it, it went against everything I believed. He looked down. I needed the money. I wanted the visibility. But something inside me said, this isn't right. So I said no. Fiona raised an eyebrow. And how did that decision go for you? Jimin smiled just a little. Not great, he admitted, at first. I went through some tough times after that, Jimin said quietly, referring to the opportunity he had once turned down. But eventually something else came along, something that did align with my principles. And because I stayed true to myself, I was ready for it. He paused. If I had taken that first job, maybe I would have gained fame faster. But I wouldn't have felt proud of what I was giving to the world. And that matters to me. The audience, once cheering Fiona's wit, now sat in utter stillness, eyes fixed on Jimin. His words weren't just memories. They were lessons in standing firm when it's hardest. Fiona, after a pause, said with a skeptical undertone, but the world doesn't usually reward integrity. Don't you think that kind of idealism is outdated? Jimin leaned back in his chair, calm but resolute. Maybe it is, he said, but that doesn't make it any less important. Integrity isn't about being rewarded. It's about being able to look in the mirror and say, I did the right thing. He let the words sit. And that, he added, never goes out of style. That is eternal. In the audience, a young woman discreetly wiped away a tear. A man near the back crossed his arms, nodding in deep thought. Jimin wasn't just speaking, he was awakening something. Fiona settled deeper into her chair, visibly absorbing the weight of the moment. Then she tried to take back control. You make it sound like you've never doubted your decisions, she said. Surely there were times when you questioned if it was worth it? Jimin didn't flinch. Of course, he said. I'm human, Fiona. I've had plenty of doubts. Times when I wondered if I was being too idealistic. But every time I faced those doubts, I reminded myself why I started. He looked out over the crowd. Because success without integrity isn't success, it's just illusion. And that reminder always brings me back. The applause that followed wasn't loud or theatrical. It was deep, honest, the kind that makes people sit a little straighter. Fiona looked out at the audience. She could feel it. The room had changed. What began as a cheeky interview with planned barbs had become a conversation about self-respect, purpose, and the courage to stay whole in a fractured world. When the applause settled, Fiona turned to Jimin. I have to admit, she said, and this time there was no mask, you've given us a lot to think about. Jimin smiled gently. That's all I ever hoped for, he replied. Life isn't about convincing everyone. It's about planting seeds and letting each person decide what to do with them. If anything I said helps even one person, that's enough. The camera zoomed in on his serene face. The moment felt almost sacred, a rare breath of stillness in the fast-paced world of late-night television. The same audience that had once been ready to laugh now looked at him with admiration. The studio felt different, more intimate, deeper. And somehow everyone knew this wasn't just another interview. You know, Jimin said after a particularly emotional pause, breaking the silence with gentle gravity, it's really easy to get lost in the noise. He glanced around the room. The world is loud now. Everyone's shouting, opinions everywhere, everyone trying to be heard. He looked back at Fiona. But truth? Truth usually shows up in the quiet, in the moments when no one's looking. The audience held its breath. Fiona didn't respond, she just listened. I've been in a lot of noisy rooms, Jimin continued. Award shows, debates, interviews, even protests. And I've learned something. Noise doesn't mean substance. The loudest voice isn't always the one you should follow. He turned to the crowd. Sometimes, it's the quietest voice that has the most to say. Fiona leaned back, visibly moved. For years, she had believed in being the loudest voice, dominating the conversation, challenging every opposing thought. But now, seeing a small doubt crept in. Had she really been listening or just waiting for her turn to speak? Jimin, she said after a long pause, do you think the world has become too noisy, too divided? He smiled slightly. I think the world's always been divided, he said, but now we hear it more. Technology, social media, news, 24/7, everyone has a mic, everyone is talking. He paused. But the real question isn't about the noise, it's about how we respond to it. Do we add to the chaos, or do we try to make sense of it? The audience murmured softly, taking in each word. And you? Fiona asked, with honest curiosity now. How do you handle the noise? The criticism? The judgment? Even about your age, your emotions, your choices? Jimin's expression softened. He looked almost reflective. I don't let it in, he said. He looked her in the eyes. The world can say whatever it wants, but at the end of the day, the only voice that truly matters is your own. He leaned forward. If you let other people define who you are, you lose yourself. And once you lose that, it's very hard to come back. In the front row, a young woman discreetly wiped away a tear. Her face was filled with admiration and thought. A middle-aged man behind her nodded slowly, arms crossed. The same audience that had come ready to laugh now sat in reverent stillness. Fiona looked down at her notes. They suddenly felt irrelevant. She closed the folder and looked up. You've lived through different eras, she said softly. K-pop has changed. The world has changed. Do you think we're heading in the right direction? Jimin paused before answering. His gaze was calm. I think progress is important, he said, but progress without reflection is dangerous. He looked into the camera. You have to know where you come from, to know where you're going. And sometimes in our rush to move forward, we forget to look back, to learn from what we've been through. The studio was utterly silent. Only the low hum of the cameras remained. Jimin glanced at the audience one last time. I'm not here to tell anyone how to live, he said, voice both firm and kind. But I'll say this, don't let the noise drown out your own voice. Don't let the world rush you into decisions you are not ready for. And don't be afraid to pause, to think, to feel, to listen. The applause started slowly, a hesitant ripple. Then it grew, not out of habit, but out of meaning. Not for entertainment, but for truth. Fiona leaned back in her chair, looking around the studio, no longer a stage, but a space of shared reflection. And when the clapping faded, she turned to Jimin. I'll be honest, she said, her voice stripped of all irony. I came here thinking I would be the one asking the difficult questions. She took a breath. But you've made me think about things I wasn't ready for. Jimin gave her a warm, quiet smile. That's the beauty of a real conversation, Edward replied. It's not about winning or losing, it's about learning. I didn't expect this, Fiona said softly. Jimin smiled at her, a calm, knowing smile. That's the beauty of a good conversation, he replied. It's not about winning or losing, it's about learning. The cameras cut to the audience, not laughing, not clapping, just listening. Some smiled faintly, others wiped away tears. Most sat in quiet contemplation. The energy in the studio had completely transformed, not by force, but by Jimin's presence, sincerity, and truth. Fiona looked at her producer, who signaled that the segment was wrapping up. She turned back to Jimin, her voice now filled with genuine warmth. Thank you, she said simply, for sharing your story and for reminding us that sometimes the moments of silence are the ones that matter most. Jimin nodded slightly and lifted his hand in a gentle farewell. Thank you for having me, Fiona, he said. It's been a pleasure. The cameras cut to commercial, but the silence remained. The usual chatter, rustling, and backstage bustle was gone. Instead, stillness, reflection. The crew and audience slowly rose from their seats, Some whispered quietly, others simply stood in thought. Fiona remained at her desk, frozen, staring at her notes. The questions she had so carefully crafted now felt hollow. She looked up as Jimin rose from his chair with the same serene grace he had brought into the room. He turned to the audience and gave one last wave, and this time the applause came not from excitement or celebrity hype, but from respect. As he left the stage, producers and crew approached him, not with skepticism, but admiration. A young cameraman, no older than 23, stepped forward nervously. "Jimin," he stammered, I just wanted to say thank you. What you said tonight really reached me." Jimin gave him a soft smile and a steady, warm handshake. "I'm glad to hear that," he said. "Life is about finding what truly matters and holding on to it. Don't let the world tell you otherwise." Meanwhile, Fiona had slipped into her dressing room. She closed the door, sat in front of the mirror, and just sat. The lights glowed around her reflection. Her makeup was perfect. But her eyes betrayed something deeper. Something shifted. She felt exposed, as if Jimin's words had peeled away layers she didn't even know were there. She whispered almost without thinking, "Was I even listening?" The question echoed, simple yet haunting. Backstage, Jimin gathered his things when Veronica, Fiona's longtime producer, approached him. "Jimin," she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft, "I just wanted to tell you that was incredible. I don't think we've ever had a guest who commanded the room like you did." He let out a quiet, humble laugh. "I wasn't trying to command anything," he replied. "I just spoke my truth. People listen when they're ready." Veronica nodded slowly. "Well, tonight I think we were ready." As they stepped out into the night, his manager Taehyung opened the car door. "I wasn't sure how this would go," Taehyung admitted, "but you handled it like a master." Jimin smiled, sliding into the seat. "It's not about handling it," he said. "It's about being yourself. The rest follows." The drive back was quiet. City lights flickered past the windows. Jimin stared outside, thoughtful. Not weighed down, but reflective. He didn't usually dwell on moments like these, but even he knew something had been different that night. The next morning, clips from the interview exploded across social media. People from all walks of life shared their reactions. Some praised Jimin's quiet strength. Others criticized Fiona's early arrogance. But the overall sentiment was clear. Respect. Respect for his vulnerability. Respect for his wisdom. Respect for the unexpected power of stillness. A short clip where Jimin said, "Integrity isn't about being popular. It's about being able to live with yourself," went viral. Within 48 hours, it had millions of views. It became a quote shared in classrooms, dorm rooms, even offices. A mantra in a world craving something real. Fiona, meanwhile, sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through the reactions. Some praised her for staying quiet. Others criticized her condescension. But what affected her most was the truth she couldn't deny. For the first time in her career, she doubted not her intelligence, but her approach. Jimin had made her face something she had avoided for years. Was she really using her platform to connect, or just to perform? The question lingered. She opened her laptop. She began to type, something unusual for her. Last night's conversation with Jimin reminded me of something I had forgotten. The power of listening. Thank you, Jimin, for your honesty, your wisdom, and your heart. You gave us all more to think about than I ever expected. She hit post, then leaned back and sighed, long and full. Meanwhile, Jimin's day was normal. He returned to practice, reviewed choreography, checked on a fan letter. The interview? It was behind him. He had said what needed to be said. That was enough. But for Fiona, it was a before and after moment. And for the audience, that night was more than entertainment. It was a reminder, that in a world addicted to noise, integrity, and truth still carry power. In the days that followed, the episode became one of the most talked about segments in late-night TV history, not because of Fiona's wit, but because of Jimin's stillness. Clips circulated globally. People shared them not to laugh, but to feel. Jimin's calm answers, his story of saying no to something shiny, his definition of strength as bending without breaking. All of it struck chords across generations. Fiona reread the comments. Yes, some were harsh, but most were thoughtful. And more importantly, something had shifted inside her. She realized sometimes the quietest voice is the one that says what the world needs to hear most. And that voice, that night by On, belonged to Jimin. He had sparked something, not just in Fiona, but in the audience. For years, Fiona had prided herself on being sharp, incisive, always in control. But now, for the first time in a long time, she wondered, had she been too focused on winning and forgotten how to truly listen? Later that evening, a gentle knock came at her dressing room door. Veronica, her producer, peeked in holding a tablet. "Have you seen the numbers?" she asked with a half smile. "It's the most watched episode we've ever aired." Fiona blinked. "Yeah, I saw." Veronica stepped in. "People are talking about the show like never before. And not because it was funny, because it was real." Fiona looked up, thoughtful. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "It was real," she said. "And it wasn't because of me. It was because of him." She leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. He didn't fight back with sarcasm or cleverness. He didn't play the game. He just spoke, and it made me think. It made all of us think, and I wasn't ready for that. Veronica smiled, quietly moved. "Maybe," she said, "we need more guests like that, people who challenge us." Fiona nodded slowly, the truth sinking in. She had spent years mastering the art of breaking people down, exposing weaknesses, poking holes, pushing buttons. But tonight had reminded her, there's something much more powerful than disarming someone. It's being disarmed by their honesty. Jimin hadn't used aggression. He didn't perform. He just was. And that had changed everything. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, Jimin's evening was simple. Back in Seoul at Big Hit's practice complex, he returned to his quiet routine. No celebration, no overanalysis, just a late walk through the garden, a cup of tea, a moment to himself. When Taehyung entered the room holding a tablet, his face lit up. "You broke the internet," he grinned, scrolling. "They're calling it one of the most powerful interviews of the year." Jimin chuckled softly. "Really?" he said, amused. "All I did was say what I needed to say." "That's what made it work," Taehyung replied. "People say it was a masterclass in authenticity." Jimin looked down, his smile faint but sincere. "Authenticity," he repeated. "How rare that feels these days." But the impact didn't stay trapped on screens. The interview sparked real conversations. At kitchen tables, in offices, in schools. A high school teacher in a small rural town showed a clip to his students and started a discussion about resilience and values. A young entrepreneur in Los Angeles said Jimin's words inspired him to walk away from a multi-million-dollar deal that didn't align with his ethics. Jimin's words reached further than he ever expected. And Fiona wasn't immune either. Weeks later, she opened a new episode of Spotlight with a tone no one had ever heard from her. Before introducing her guest, she looked into the camera and said, "Before we begin tonight, I want to talk about something I haven't been able to shake since our last show with Jimin. That conversation wasn't just another one. It was a wake-up call. He reminded me, and all of us, of the importance of listening, of being present, of being true to who we are. And for that, I want to thank him." The audience was stunned, but then offered gentle, heartfelt applause. It wasn't the kind of applause Fiona was known for. It wasn't loud. It was real. The appearance of Jimin on Spotlight became television history, not because of a viral takedown, not because of clever sound bites, but because it was one of the rare moments where everyone stopped and listened. Even in a world drowning in noise and division, there was still room for the quiet strength of integrity, the slow courage of being yourself, the radical power of simply speaking the truth. For Fiona, it was a turning point, one that led her to rethink her role, not as a performer, but as a listener. For Jimin, it was just another day living his principles. And for the audience, it was a moment they would carry with them, a quiet reminder that sometimes the softest voices are the ones that echo the longest.